I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading Chapter 11 of Charity's Chosen by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 11. Charity had just finished her supper when Mrs. Atfield came into the room. The poor woman was very flushed and agitated, and her voice shook when she spoke. "I want you, Charity, in my room, please, at once." Charity followed her with a fast-beating heart. It was so unusual for Mrs. Atfield to require her presence that she was afraid something very serious must be the matter. Myrtle was sitting by the fire in her mother's room. She still wore the coat in which she had traveled, and her hat lay on the floor at her feet. She looked ill, and her eyes were red with weeping. She did not even glance up when Charity entered. She just sat with her hands clasped in her lap, staring at the fire with angry, hopeless eyes. Mrs. Atfield shut the door securely and spoke. "I sent for you, Charity, because I believe you are to be trusted, and I must trust somebody." And then she made her dramatic announcement. "Myrtle has run away from her husband." Charity said nothing, but Myrtle turned her head, and the ghost of a smile crossed her white face. "It is quite true," she said defiantly. "I ran away. I left him in Paris, and I'm not going back, whatever Mother says, or whatever anyone else says. I was a fool to marry him. In my heart, I knew I was a fool, and yet I went on with it." "Think of the scandal," her mother wailed. "What will people say? You've only been married 2 weeks. "I don't care what they say," Myrtle said obstinately. Mrs. Atfield stared at her daughter with frustrated eyes. "If you think you can stay here, you are mistaken," she said tartly. "I suppose Richard will arrive tomorrow. I suppose he will conclude that you have come home. I left a note at the hotel, telling him I was coming to London." Mrs. Atfield looked relieved. "Then of course he will follow at once." She made a rapid calculation. "If he catches the night boat, he should be here in the morning." Her face cleared. "After all, perhaps there is not so much harm done. I can telephone to his flat, or you can, Myrtle, and say that you have arrived earlier than you anticipated, and tell them to prepare for you. Then you can wait quietly here for Richard, and go to the flat together tomorrow." "I am never going to live with him again," Myrtle said. Mrs. Atfield flushed with anger. "Then you can make your own arrangements," she said sharply. I will not be a party to such a scandal. You have made your own bed, and you must lie on it." Myrtle's eyes were contemptuous. "I rather fancy you made it for me," she said. She looked at her cousin. "Well, you don't seem to have anything to say," she commented wearily. Charity went to her and took her hand. "I'm so sorry. I only want to help," she said. Someone tapped at the door. "Please, madame, can I speak to you for a moment?" Mrs. Atfield frowned as she turned to leave the room. "Stay with her, Charity. I shall only be a moment." When she had gone, Myrtle sprang to her feet, her whole face changing. She looked as if someone had touched a hidden spring and brought her back to life. "Well, what did Hugh say? I thought you would have written to tell me. Did you see him? What did he say?" She almost shook Charity in her impatience. Charity answered as best she could. "He was very upset, of course. I was with him for a long time. He gave me some tea. I can't remember everything he said. I don't suppose he said anything kind, did he? He was always a brute if he could not get his own way. I think he was too unhappy to know what he said. I felt most dreadfully sorry for him," Charity answered. Myrtle went back to her chair. "Well, you need not feel sorry any more," she said after a little pause. "I love him, and I die to make him happy. These last 2 weeks have taught me that nothing matters except happiness, and I'm going to be happy, whatever Mother says. She made me marry Richard. I did it to please her, but now I'm going to please myself." Charity felt as if a rough hand had squeezed her heart. "Why, what are you going to do?" she faltered. Myrtle laughed. There was a fierce sparkle in her eyes. "I'm going to run away with you," she said, "if you'll have me." Charity gasped, and her color faded. "Run away? With Mr. Heather?" "Yes, but you're married." Myrtle shrugged her shoulders. "I don't count that. I hate Richard, and he doesn't care a snap for me. He only wanted me because he thought I should be an ornament to his house, and I've done with him. Mother talks about scandal. There can be no greater scandal than my marriage." She broke down, wringing her hands in despair. "Oh, I was a fool, she wailed. Charity stood like a statue. To run away with Mr. Heather! For the first time, bitterest jealousy swept through her heart. Yes, Myrtle knew her power well enough. It was unlikely that Heather would care for the scandal their action would cause, if only he could get the woman he wanted. "You're not very sympathetic," Myrtle sobbed. "I thought you would be kind and help me." "Of course I will help you. What can I do?" Mrs. Atfield came back before Myrtle could answer. I have rung up Richard's flat," she said, "and everything will be in readiness for you in 2 hours' time. I explained that Richard would not be here until tomorrow. I think I succeeded in making things appear all right, but heaven knows if the maids suspect anything or not." She sat down heavily on a chair. "I have told Ellen to bring you some wine and some sandwiches, Myrtle. You cannot appear at dinner. The fewer people you see, the better, especially with your eyes in such a state." Myrtle started up, her face flushed, her eyes passionate. "I will not be ordered about as if I were a child," she stormed. "I will not go to Richard's flat. I have a right to my own happiness, and I tell you that I have done with him. Done with him!" "You are a bad, wicked girl," her mother said. "And if I am, I take after you," Myrtle cried passionately. "You've made me what I am. You never wanted me to be happy. You only wanted me to be rich. But I don't care. I don't care what scandal there is. You can say what you like." Then suddenly her courage failed, and she fell to weeping again piteously. Charity knelt down beside her, and she was almost crying herself. "Myrtle, please, please," she begged. "Oh, don't cry any more. You'll make yourself so ill. I'll come with you. I'll stay with you in Mr. Pelham's flat. I won't leave you, I promise." Mrs. Atfield gave a great sigh of relief. "There you are. It's much more than you deserve, Myrtle. But if Charity really means what she says, it will be a great relief to me to know that you have someone sensible with you. Dry your eyes and don't be so foolish. Ellen will be here in a moment, and a nice scandal there will be amongst the servants if she sees you crying like this. There is the gong for dinner. Charity, I leave Myrtle to you." She went away confident of having won the battle, and Myrtle dried her eyes and pushed back her tumbled hair. "I suppose it's wicked to hate one's own mother," she said in a stifled voice. "But there are times when I hate mine." Charity made no reply. She knew it was useless to argue while Myrtle was in such distress. When the wine and sandwiches came, she gently insisted on her cousin eating and drinking, and was relieved to find her growing quieter. "Do you really mean that you'll come with me?" Myrtle asked anxiously. "If Mother turns me out tonight, and I have to go alone, I'll drown myself." "It's silly to talk like that," Charity said, trying hard to speak in a matter-of-fact tone. "Drowning's a nasty death, anyway." "It can't be worse than life with a man you hate," Myrtle said. Charity made no reply. She might have said, "Well, that's your own fault. He wanted you." But she held her tongue. She could only try not to think of the future and what it might mean for them all. She packed a suitcase, and at 10:30 she and Myrtle drove away together. Pelham's flat was in Half Moon Street, an elaborate, oppressive flat, which filled Charity with awe. I don't wonder she hates him if he's like his flat to live with," she thought quaintly. "I'd rather have Mr. Heather's rooms, even if they are shabby." She was given a little bedroom which led out of Myrtle's, a room with wonderful inlaid furniture, and a carpet into which one's feet sank at every step. Charity took off her shoes and stockings and walked about on it, delightful in its soft springiness. "It's like moss," she said to Myrtle, appearing at the open communicating door. "Isn't it wonderful what lovely things there are in the world?" "I hate lovely things," Myrtle said with a sob. "You made a day," Charity said with wisdom. "But I think if you always had to live with bare boards and hard beds, you would hate them more." Myrtle had crept into bed. She was worn out with emotion, and when Charity went in to say good night to her, her eyes were closed in pretended sleep, though when Charity bent to give her a gentle kiss, she suddenly stirred and put her arms around the girl's neck. "I wish I were contented and simple like you," she said with passionate regret. "How can you manage to be so happy when I can't see that you've got anything to be happy about?" "I don't know that I am very happy," Charity said with a pang, "but I don't try to be," she added. She lay awake for a long time, looking into the future. She was not usually afraid of life, or apprehensive of things to come, but tonight she felt as if dark, sinister wings were flapping closely about her, and it was many hours before sleep came to her eyes, and in the morning there was a wire from Pelham announcing his arrival by midday, or early evening at the latest, and a telephone call from Mrs. Atfield to say that she, too, had heard from her son-in-law from Paris, and that she did hope Myrtle was going to be sensible, and that she had quite recovered from her hysterical attack of last night. She said this to Charity, having first inquired where Myrtle was, and when she was told that Myrtle was still in bed, she observed truculently that it was the best place for her. "If you can only keep her quiet until Richard comes, all will be well," she prophesied. Charity had her doubts, but she promised to do her best. When Myrtle was dressed, they went for a walk in the park. You'll be ashamed of me. My clothes are so ordinary, Charity said, but Myrtle only laughed. I'd rather be with you in rags I'd rather be with you in rags than me in this, she said. I'd rather be you in rags than me and in this, she said, contemptuously touching her expensive sable coat. They walked in the park till lunch, and Charity marveled at the complete ease and self-possession with which Myrtle greeted any friend she met. Yes, we had to return sooner than we expected. Such a pity, but Richard had some business. I left him in Paris yesterday, and he joins me today. It made last night's scene of distress seem so unreal, Charity thought, and she could hardly persuade herself that it had ever really happened. It made her wonder also whether her aunt had not been right, and that Myrtle would soon get over her attack of hysteria and settle down more or less happily and comfortably. They spent the afternoon in the flat. I'm tired, Myrtle complained. I'm going to lie down, and please don't wake me till 6, or unless Richard comes, she added with her eyes averted. What will you do with yourself? She asked, as Charity made no comment. I'll find a book, Charity said. She found a copy of Browning's poems, marveling how they had got into Pelham's flat. She could not imagine that he would care for poetry, and ensconced herself comfortably in a big chair, which seemed all softness and ease by the fire. Charity loved poetry, and as she opened the book at hazard, her eyes fell on the first verse of The Lost Mistress. All's over then. Does truth seem bitter, as one at first believes? Hark, till the sparrows good night twitter about your cottage eaves. And suddenly Charity felt her eyes smarting with tears, though why she could not have explained. Were those tears for herself, or for Myrtle, or for Heather, whom they both loved? Of course, he would go away with Myrtle. Tomorrow we meet the same, then, dearest. May I take your hand in mine? Mere friends are we, well, friends the merest. Keep much that I'll resign. As she read on, she seemed to see Heather's hard, unromantic face looking up at her from between the lines, and it came to her in swift and bitter realization that no matter how much she might pretend to herself, if the worst happened and he went away with Myrtle, she could never be happy again. She wanted him to have what he wanted, and yet, but oh, why can't he want me? She asked herself desolately. The book slipped to the floor from her lap, and she lost herself in dreaming which presently changed to drowsiness, so that soon she slept with the firelight warm upon her face. It was late when she woke. The room was half in darkness, and a maid was quietly pulling the curtains. Charity started up. Oh, what time is it? It's 10 minutes past 6, miss. The girl smiled as she looked at Charity. Has Mr. Pelham come? Not yet, miss. Charity hurried upstairs to Myrtle's room. She knocked, but as there was no reply, she opened the door and went in. The room was empty. Charity stood staring around her with blank eyes. There was a little note propped up against the silver mirror in a conspicuous place. Charity went across to it. Somehow she knew what had happened before she opened it and read the few lines addressed to herself. I'm sorry, Charity. I'm afraid it's mean of me after all your kindness, but I have to do the best I can for myself now. I've gone to Hugh, and I shall not come back. Goodbye, Myrtle. Charity stood staring at the hurriedly scribbled note, her eyes wide, her lips fallen tragically apart. Then suddenly she came to life. She turned and fled to her room and caught up a coat. She forgot her hat, and just as she went out of the flat, hailed the first taxicab she saw, and gave Heather's address. How long had Myrtle been gone? She might have slept for an hour or two, long enough for her cousin to have got right away from London. Had it all been arranged beforehand? And was Heather a party to it? Charity's thoughts were all tumbled confusion, and her pulses raced. She literally flung herself from the cab when it stopped, then turned to the driver with a gasp of remembrance. I've got no money. I was in such a hurry I forgot. You must wait while I get some from the people here. The man looked at her curiously, and he got down from his seat and waited on the path while Charity ran to the big entrance to the flats. Was she too late, or was she in time? Her heart pounded as she went up the stone staircase. She remembered her first visit, and the first time she ever saw Hugh Heather, when cold and miserable and hungry she waited outside in Harvey's car. Hello, funny face! The kindliness of his voice had struck warmth to her heart, and the strong security of his arms when he lifted her, all chilled and miserable from her cramped seat, had seemed like heaven. From that moment she had loved him, and now he was on the point of going out of her life forever, if he had not already gone, with another woman. Charity knocked on his door with a hand that shook. He would have hated her for interfering, of course. He had once said that she was always his bearer of bad news. It was true. It had seemed so hard, Charity thought, when she only so passionately desired his happiness. For some moments there was no answer to her knock, and she repeated it more loudly. "They've gone," she told herself in despair, "or else they won't answer. What shall I do?" She was afraid of a dozen things, of what her aunt would say, and of what the world would say. She was afraid of the future for Myrtle. She seemed lately to understand so positively that she and Heather could never really be happy together, and she was afraid for Heather himself. Was he never to have any happiness? She knocked again more loudly, and presently she heard a man's heavy tread inside, and then the door was opened by Heather himself. Charity tried to speak and failed. She could only stare at him with large eyes, and it was Heather who broke the silence. "So, it's the stormy petrel, is it?" "Yes, it's me," said Charity, and before he could prevent her, she had slipped under his arm and into the flat. Then she turned to face him. "I know she's here," she said breathlessly. At first it seemed as if he would deny it. Then he shrugged his shoulders and shut the door. "Well," he said cynically, "you told me once before that I was a brute to her. How would you like to find me kind for a change?" "Kind?" Charity faltered. "Yes." His eyes furiously challenged her. "Don't you want me to take her away from that brute she has married, and make her Don't you want me to take her away from the brute she has married, and make her what I suppose you would call happy ever after?" There was a little silence. "If you do that," Charity said tensely, "you'll be a bigger brute than I thought you were before." Heather laughed. "Perhaps you'll walk in and tell that to Myrtle yourself," he said with sarcasm. "I intend to," Charity answered. She took a step towards the sitting room, then stopped with a gasp of remembrance. "The taxi man! He's waiting! I haven't got any money. I told him you would pay." "He can wait and take you back," Heather said shortly. "But I'm not going back unless Myrtle comes with me," Charity said quickly. He stared at her with hard eyes. Then he answered, "Well, you'd better tell her that as well." "Yes," said Charity readily, and she went on into the sitting room, followed by Heather. Myrtle was standing by the table, and Charity thought she had never seen a more tragic figure. She was white and defiant, and her face was disfigured with crying. When she saw Charity, she made a pathetic gesture of despair. Charity went to her. "I've got a taxicab outside," she said gently. "We'll go back together. Nobody will ever know." "I'm not going back," Myrtle said fiercely. Charity looked at Heather. He was standing in the doorway, watching them both with unsmiling eyes. "You see what your interference has done," he said harshly. "Myrtle has decided to take the advice you have so often given to us both." "But she can't!" Charity cried out. "It would be wicked. She's married." Myrtle broke in recklessly. "I don't care for that. I must have been mad to think I could ever be happy with anyone but you, and will never leave him again." With a swift movement, she slipped past Charity and went to Heather, and before he could prevent her, she had lifted his hand to her lips with a little gesture of abandonment and kissed it. Heather tore his hand away, and Charity broke out fiercely, her pale face flushing scarlet. "In a month's time you'll be tired of him, Myrtle, and you'll be longing for all the things you think it's so easy to give up now." And in her heart she was crying miserably. "It's no use. It's all wrong. They'll be miserable. She doesn't love him, not with the love that lasts. What can I do to save them both?" She tried not to remember that in all probability Heather was perfectly content with the turn events had taken. She looked at him with burning eyes. "You'll be a coward if you don't send her away," she accused him. "You wouldn't be kind to her when she wanted you, and when it was all right. But now you're going to ruin her whole life." Myrtle turned fiercely. "It's not your business. Leave me alone." Heather took a step forward. He spoke to Charity. "Please take Myrtle away." Charity gasped. "Take her away? Unless you want Pelham or someone else to find her here." Myrtle broke into bitter sobbing. "You are cruel. I thought you loved me." She was clinging to his arm with both imploring hands. "You can't want me to go back to Richard. You know I hate him. You know." She broke off with a gasp as there was a sudden knocking at the outer door. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Heather turned. "Stay here. I'll see who it is. Let me go, Myrtle." "Supposing it's Richard?" She was hysterical and half-fainting. "Nonsense! How can he know you are here?" Sudden, terrified remembrance stabbed Charity's mind. Myrtle's note. She had left it behind in her cousin's bedroom. In her hurry and excitement she had forgotten all about it. She took a frightened step forward. "Your letter," she whispered. "I left it." And in the following silence, the knocking came again, more loudly and insistently. Myrtle closed her eyes. "It's Richard, I know it is," she said with white lips. Heather stood irresolute. Then suddenly he caught Myrtle by her slender shoulders, turning her to him so that she was forced to meet his eyes. "If it is, am I to tell him you are here or not?" he asked very quietly, but Charity saw the look in his eyes, and her heart seemed to die. Oh, if only he ever loved her like that! If only once he would look at her as he looked at him, as he had looked in her dream. Myrtle did not answer. She seemed almost paralyzed. She would have fallen but for Heather's upholding hands. And he said again, "Am I to tell him or not? You must choose between us once and for all. I'm not afraid of him, if you are not." Still no answer, and the knocking came again, furiously this time, as if the man outside would batter the door down. Myrtle found her voice then, in a gasping whisper. "Don't tell him!" For a moment Heather neither moved nor spoke. His eyes were fixed upon her white face with a look of blank incredulity. Then, with a short, contemptuous laugh, he let her go, so suddenly that she fell in a little limp heap at his feet and lay there. And then he spoke to Charity. "Get her away. There's another room into the passage through my bedroom. If it's Pelham, I will bring him in here. Only be quick." "Yes." Charity knelt down beside her cousin and tried gently to raise her. "Come with me. He must not find you here. Oh, come with me, Myrtle, before it is too late." She could hear the men's angry voices outside, and Heather's defiant laugh, and with sudden strength, of which she would have never believed herself capable, she half lifted, half dragged Myrtle into Heather's bedroom, and shut the communicating door. She made Myrtle drink some water, and she bathed her face, talking urgently to her all the time. "You must help yourself. Everything will be all right if only you will try and help. Nobody will ever know. I give you my word that nobody will ever know if only you are brave." Myrtle had recovered a little and was clinging frantically to her. "Take me away. I don't want to stay. I'm afraid. Let me go. Oh, take me away." The angry voices were nearer now, in the next room it seemed, and Charity rushed to the second door, which led out into the passage. It was locked, but the key was there, and she turned it. Then, with an arm round Myrtle, she dragged her across the hall and out onto the stone staircase. "Run," she whispered tremulously. "Run! There's a taxi waiting. Take it and go back to the flat." She did not wait to see whether she was obeyed or not. She ran back into Heather's bedroom. She felt terribly shaken, and all her nerves seemed jarred, and yet she was only conscious of badly wanting to laugh. It all seemed so foolish and unreal, like the melodramatic books which one read. She tried to collect her thoughts, but she felt as if they had been broken into 1,000 useless fragments. Did Myrtle love Heather or not? One moment she declared she would never leave him again, and the next, at the sound of her husband's voice, she had been almost helpless with fear. As if she could really be frightened if Mr. Heather was with her, Charity told herself, amazed. She did not understand the shallow impulses of her cousin's heart. Myrtle always wanted the things she had not got. No doubt she cared as much for Heather as it was possible for her to care for anyone, and the impulse which drove her to him had been real enough while it lasted. But with the sound of her husband knocking at the door, the world and self-love knocked also. In a flash she had realized all she stood to lose, wealth and position and her pride. These things would hold Myrtle long after her wayward passion for Heather was dead, and in that last moment with Heather's hands gripping her shoulders, she seemed to see facts more clearly than ever before. Am I to tell him you are here, or not? Don't tell him. Although she had only whispered the words, they sounded to her cowardly ears like a scream. She was like a wild animal, momentarily tempted by an appetizing bait, who hears the snap of the trap. Well, now she had gone, and Charity was left alone in Heather's room, shaking in every limb, only conscious that this meant some sort of crisis in her life, for which she had no time to prepare. Angry voices still on the other side of the door. Heather's and Richard Pelham's. Heather's is slightly raised above the others. I tell you she is not here. I tell you, very well, look for yourself. And before Charity could move, or think what was best to do, the communicating doors flung open, and both men stood on the threshold. For breathless seconds nobody spoke. Then Heather said savagely, "You damned little fool!" He had been so sure that Charity would have sufficient sense to go with Myrtle. It had never occurred to him that she would do anything else, and Charity read the thought in his eyes, and at the same moment realized her own foolishness. It was Pelham who spoke first. "Oh, I see. So the mystery is explained. He laughed and stared at Charity with insolent eyes. I think this was your destination on the occasion of our first meeting, was it not? He asked coolly. He turned to Heather. Well, I think the score between us is square at last, Heather? Not yet. Heather's voice was dangerously calm, but his face was livid, and before Charity could guess his intention, he had struck Pelham a terrific blow in the face with his clenched fist. Pelham went down like a log, but before Heather could move, Charity had flung herself between the two men and was clinging to Heather's arm. No, you'll kill him! No, my dear, I beg of you! She was unconscious of the little endearment. She was too terrified to realize anything, except that she thought she saw murder in his eyes. She clung to him with all her strength, crying out to Pelham to go! Pelham needed no second opportunity. With his face bruised and bleeding, he scrambled to his feet. I'll remember you for this. I'll pay you out for this, he stammered thickly. Go, Charity implored him, and a moment later she heard the slam of the outer door. Heather shook her off easily enough, and she fell back against the table, her breath almost gone, her eyes closed. Heather stood looking at her and breathing hard. His face was gray, and his lips shook so with rage that he could hardly speak. So that was your game, was it? He said brutally. That was your idea in coming back, to let Pelham find you and to compromise me. He laughed in an ugly fashion. Well, you've wasted your time, and that's all I can tell you, and you'll have to stand the racket. Pelham will tell everyone he found you here, of course, if that's what you wanted. He's safe as houses to tell everyone. He came a swift stride nearer to her. But if you think that will influence me in the least, or drive me to marry you, you've made the biggest mistake in your life. He broke off, for Charity had slowly opened her eyes. Such dark, tragic eyes they were, and full of unutterable woe. Oh, she said, and her voice was broken with pain. Oh, don't say such cruel things to me. Please. You'll be so sorry someday. So sorry. Then, without any warning, she fell fainting at his feet. And that is the end of Chapter 11 of Charity's Chosen by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope you return soon to hear the next one. Have a great day.